Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new double album from the game, the Documentary 2 and the Documentary 2.5. But first, let's talk a little bit about double albums. Now, I've covered a fair few of them this year, most notably Summertime '06 by Vince Staples and The Powers That Be by Death Grips. And in both those cases, I was left feeling that positioning them both as double albums might not have been the best decision, as they could have been slashed down to tighter single albums with less filler. Or in the case of Death Grips, they could have just stuck with Jenny Death, it would have been better. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not averse to the double album as a concept. One of my favorite records of all time, Aryon's The Human Equation, prime example. But let's be honest, even Ariane Lucasson struggled with his double album, The Diary, under the Gentle Storm name this year. Yeah, I can appreciate making both a heavy and light version of every song, then encouraging your audience to mix and match, but you could have done that yourself, and it could have been a much tighter album. So when I heard that West Coast MC The Game wasn't just releasing a sequel to his critically acclaimed record, The Documentary, but structuring it as a double album release called The Documentary 2 and The Documentary 2.5, yes, I know each disc was released a week apart, but look, it's a double album, let's be real here. I was seriously worried. Even assuming the best case scenario that each of these hour-plus albums would come together, the odds of this project just being an exhausting endeavor to work through seem very likely. And even though Blood Moon Year the Wolf wasn't apparently a full project from the game, it was hard to overlook that that was a fragmented mess that had way too many guest stars and opted for a lot more style over substance, which, yeah, the kind of the game's MO, but it could have been done a lot better. But then again, maybe I'm being unfair here. Most people absolutely love the song the game effectively made his own on Dr. Dre's newest album, Compton. And considering he was directly positioning this album as sequels to the one that made him huge, I had some hope this would work. Of course, he also brought in all the stops as hip-hop's best networker since Master P. And on this double album, we have Kendrick Lamar, DJ Loaf, Ice Cube, Dre, will.i.am, Fergie, Puff Daddy, Absol, Q-Tip, Future, Kanye West, Drake, Snoop Dogg, Anderson .Paak, J-Rock, Schoolboy Q, Nas, Lil Wayne, Scarface, DJ Quick, E40, Ty Dolla $ign, YG, King Mez, John Connor, and Busta Rhymes, and those are the names that I immediately recognized. Although, considering all the hype and his blood affiliation, I'm surprised Young Thug doesn't show up. So, okay, I expected all this to be an overlong, bloated mess. Was I right? Well, here's the thing. After the first 4 or 5 listens that I listened through all of this, I was thinking that covering both these at once might have been a mistake, because of course I'd just get burned out on the game. But a few more listens concern two things for me. If I didn't cover these at the same time, I'd run out of things to say about this album, and since both these albums are overlong, I'd be getting burned out anyways. I will say that listening to the Documentary 2 and 2.5 did solidify a few suspicions I had about the game, the biggest being that it's got a lot more talent than ideas, yet he tries so damn hard that I want to root for the guy. And yet I can't say that either of these albums are anything more than decent, but messy stabs at gangster rap that doesn't do enough to stand apart from the rest. And while both discs have distinctly different issues, the easiest way to improve both of them would be by cutting probably 4 or 5 songs a piece. So let's start with the big common element, the game himself, who has always been something of a contradiction as a rapper. He's got good flows, he sounds really good on a beat, but his technical rhyming skills are haphazard, he can get lazy. He's got tons of charisma, he can sound visceral, yet he feels the need to collaborate with everyone and constantly name drop, which can come across a little bit tacky and frankly a little desperate. And as for his many songs where he sounds good with his own flow, once again he spends a significant chunk of both these albums copying other people's cadences and even their delivery, which yes does show some talent, but doesn't help you stand out yourself. And just like previous albums, he's all over the place in terms of who he wants to be as a rapper. Hard-edged gangster versus conscious thug. Reality show luxury rap player versus responsible father figure. Half glorification, half subversion, all of it delivered with so much sincerity, he just wished the game would make up his goddamn mind who he wants to be as an artist. I'm very tempted to blame this all on the tendency for calling up so many guest stars and then falling into their style. As I and so many other critics have said in the past, I'm convinced the game could make a great solo album with no features. Hell, when you give him tracks like the title track Documentary 2, he's actually pretty solid. But since that's not happening anytime soon, let's go through the guest stars that actually stood out. Kendrick, solid, as you'd expect, even though he's done better this year. Dre and Ice Cube, they're decent on nothing they didn't do better on Compton. And it doesn't help matters that the game says both songs imitating Kendrick. He does something similar on A Dollar and a Dream imitating Kanye, but Absol delivers a decent verse and overall pretty damn good song. Hell, when Schoolboy Q and J-Rock show up later, they clean up on Gangbang anyway, with J-Rock easily being the standout. Then Anderson .Paak shows up for 2 songs on the Documentary 2.5 to prove that Dre definitely made a good choice to co-sign this guy, both for hooks and some really conscious bars. Similar case for King Mez later on Moment of Violence. The big surprises for me came came with Jelly Roll hollering his lungs out on the explosive hashtag, and later cooling off a little bit on Summertime, not quite as good. Then there was Scream and AD being pretty solid in the posse chat, My Flags to Homies, and will.i.am, of all people, actually delivering some decent hooks that weren't drowned out in effects, and a sports reference loaded verse on LA that was actually pretty decent. But outside all that, Future's moaning did nothing. Snoop Dogg definitely underwhelmed me after how strong he was on Compton, and Drake's verse on 100 really was nothing that I found incredibly special considering all the rest of his output throughout the course of this year. And then there was Kanye on Moolah, and Lil Wayne on From Adam, and E40 on Outside, and John Connor on Moment of Violence, and Busta Rhymes on Like Father Like Son 2, which are prime examples of the game completely wasting his guest stars. You got two of the biggest rappers of the past decade, and three more incredibly solid spitters, and then just stick them on the hook and doing ad-libs? Really? Couldn't have found them to drop a verse or something? But now we gotta talk about the actual content. And look guys, there's a limit of what I can say here, because it's not like the game switched up his formula all that much, and it really comes down to the points where he does that formula well. Bragging, violence, although it's not nearly as graphic as he's been in the past, repping for Compton and the Bloods, and especially on the first disc, tracks about his stream of issues with women. The latter two comes up on the absolute worst two songs on this entire project. Dedicated with Future, and Bitch You Ain't Shit. The latter which might as well be a sequel to Drips by Eminem and Obi Trice from the Eminem Show, except gratuitously scatological and really a lot worse. It's not even funny. Although the hookup on Sex Skit on Documentary 2.5, pretty far from flattering too. But it's the Bloods affiliation that raised a lot more interesting questions on this record. Not just because Schoolboy Q is affiliated with the Crips and on this album, but for as much as the game holds up that red banner, the Documentary 2.5 tries to raise some commentary on the gang violence in the bigger picture, including a reenactment of that famous murder in 1972 that started that gang war. And while I'm not gonna say it completely backfires, I definitely question whether or not the game was the right person to make that commentary, especially when his deeper insight and questioning is so painfully thin. Yeah, I know, Nas does his thing on the Ghetto by describing the underlying poverty, nothing that Nas hasn't done before, but still done well. But then the game drops one of his most telling lines addressing his critics. I ain't trying to kick knowledge, just a pair of graphic parables. Okay, so not only do you undercut the moments where real knowledge and insight might have been dropped from either you or your guest stars, but where it's supposed to treat this all just like your life stories, all the weight on this album then falls on whether or not we find the game compelling as a character that we want to hear songs about. So when on the very next track, he talks about how he thinks he got set up by the Bloods when he got shot, and he thinks about quitting gangs entirely, and on the very next song, he goes right back to saying he'd give up all that money because he just loves being a Blood. I'm sorry, that makes no sense. I got no reason to sympathize with you here. And then he follows up with Last Time You Seen, a tribute to Tupac that really is saved by Scarface's heartfelt verse, cause the game's rambling about how several of the deaths of several rappers were an LAPD conspiracy, and saying the last time he saw Tupac was in the mirror. That runs up to the line of good taste. Really, as long as you've been in the industry, you should know better. And then in a complete whiplash, instrumentally and lyrically in terms of tone, after a radio skit interlude, the album goes straight for G-Funk hedonism and abandons any attempt to be remotely thought-provoking until the song for his sons Like Father Like Son 2, and a brief stab at politics on the album closer Life. Well, at least for the first third of that song. But you know what, believe it or not, there's a lot I can forgive if the production holds up. I don't need the game to bring a lot of insight to the table. And he got a murderous row of in-demand producers to flesh out some of these records with some explosive, aggressive beats with plenty of West Coast G-Funk touches. Although, again, he sacrifices the overall cohesion of both these albums to do it. And it's rare that we get much more grit or texture in some of these beats. What's very telling is that many of these beats sound more tailored for the guest stars than they do for the game himself. Most immediately noticeable in the TDE collaborations, with maybe the exception of Ab Soul on the bass-heavy soulful swell of Dollar and a Dream, which is a pretty damn good song anyways. That's probably the reasons why 100 and Dedicated feel like cuts from Drake and Future albums respectively, and not good cuts. And Moolah felt like a warped, swamped out version of Kanye's newest songs that honestly doesn't go as hard as I was expecting and really does not flatter that Phanogram sample. That being said, there were definitely some production on that first disc that I really enjoyed, like the processed horn bounce on Standing on Ferraris. That song's just hilarious. The menacing guitar wobble against the stomping beat on Hashtag, and the scratchy piano accented title track, the courtesy of DJ Premier and Dre. And I'd argue that things get even better on the Documentary 2.5, with a great funky hook with the horns on Crenshaw, 80s and Cocaine, the impressively bleak crescendo off the ghostly pianos on Gang Bang Anyway, the gleaming horns against the scratchy bass on From Adam, the Cool and the Gang sample driving up on the wall, to that real menace off the bass against the distant guitar on Moment of Violence. Unfortunately, those moments have to share space with the shift to smoky G-Funk and quirky borderline 80s disco courtesy of DJ Quick, which sure, it It was funky as hell, pretty damn fun, but it's not like the game remotely tried to ride that groove all that well and came across inconsistent. Really not a good fit for his voice. But then again, inconsistent was the word I'd use for both these discs, no matter how much I wanted to like them. And I really did, because that's the most frustrating thing. The game is a good rapper. He's got real charisma, a solid sense of humor, an underappreciated knack for some vivid storytelling, even some of the gangbanging tracks on this record, and he can be convincingly visceral. But you know what? He's diluting his own brand in his market by flooding it with material. If we could have chopped this double release down to one record of purely the best cuts, he could have a sequel worthy of the documentary. As it is, which of the documentary 2 or 2.5 you like more will depend on what you're looking for from the game, as I'd argue the latter disc has more unique flavor and a little bit more thought into the lyrics, but not those big commercial hits and features. But even though the documentary 2.5 is more experimental, it also has some of the most questionable lyrical moments on this album, with the exception of Bitch You Ain't Shit, I guess. Either way, if we're gonna rate these albums, the documentary 2 gets a light 6, and the documentary 2.5 gets a strong 6, which rounds out to a 6 right down the middle. For fans of the game, you got them for over 2 hours. You can't ask for more there. For everyone else, well, I can promise that you won't be bored, and really, that's saying something. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I may be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I would be more than happy to give them a listen. Let's see if I can get that Demi Lovato review out tonight, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time. Talking to town, primo, Dr. Dre still hold me